Alright guys, we're going to talk about one of the most fascinating subjects in all of world history that a lot of people rarely have time to get to. And we're talking about genocide and decolonization as it relates to the Cold War. And I know in a lot of these I put in some extra information that's not on your notes, and that's okay. Today we're going to focus on this, the last big day in notes here, and that is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, Friday, the last day of in-person class, we talked about Joseph Stalin coming to power and how all that worked with Vladimir Lenin and all of that good stuff. Well, Stalin is going to reign there from the time he takes over through World War II to the beginnings of the Cold War. And we saw his bumbling with the Berlin Airlift and things of that nature. And Stalin will rely on his good buddy and right-hand man, Nikita Khrushchev, who will eventually become Stalin's successor. In 1956, Khrushchev, even though when Stalin was alive, was a staunch Stalin supporter, begins to publicly criticize some of the things that Stalin did, some of the things that Khrushchev helped him do. And he starts a process that has a pretty catchy name called de-Stalinization. We are going to roll back or walk back some of the problems that Joseph Stalin created. However, it was yet one more piece of propaganda. It sounded good, it looked good in the headlines, but there was very little, if any, change whatsoever. One of the things Khrushchev was determined to maintain, even though he comes and speaks with Presidents Eisenhower and before him Truman, and even got to meet one of his actor idols, John Wayne, Khrushchev wants to desperately maintain the Iron Curtain. Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, those countries on the border between Western Europe and Russia. Problem is, due to Soviet intervention, a lot of the people in those countries began to starve. The cut that they got from their Soviet dominators was not much. And when people begin to starve, they often begin to rebel. And that's exactly what happens to communist rule in Eastern Europe. Like a good Soviet leader, when the people rebel, Khrushchev simply sends in his soldiers and his tanks to brutally put down these rebellions. Now, Khrushchev will last for, about 10 years, when a new communist leader will replace him. His name is Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev will stay in power for nearly 20 years. Again, I clearly remember when Brezhnev was ousted, 1982, beginning of the Reagan administration, halfway through Reagan's first term. Now, Brezhnev, like any good Soviet leader, will quickly beat down and stuff any dissent, any criticism of communist rule in his country. And the two leaders, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, will spend exorbitant amounts of the country's money on science and technology during the Cold War military buildup, trying to compete with and get ahead of the United States, not only in military areas, but other areas like space. And one of the big hallmarks of the Khrushchev-Brezhnev era is in 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first man-made craft vehicle that will orbit the Earth in outer space. It is a big political and propaganda coup for the communists. Now, using this propaganda, Khrushchev is going to tout the Soviet system. And here in the dark red is the Soviet Union, and in the pink are the Iron Curtain countries. And he says, see, communism is great. We're beating you to space. We've got free health care. Everybody has access to a doctor, and every single one of our people are employed. But they didn't say where they were employed and how much they were getting paid. And underneath this, if you poked your head beneath the the Soviet propaganda, you would find that Brezhnev and Khrushchev, both of them, were in any way, shape, or form able to solve the fundamental problems with the Soviet economy. Things going back all the way to Vladimir Lenin, even maybe before the Tsarist regime. It'll produce quick results in the short term, but it does the same thing in places like Cambodia later on, but they can't sustain it. It's not a long-term solution. The state-planned economy, those spreadsheets that I told you about where you're going to get this much seed, this much fertilizer, it'll arrive on this date. If you plant it on this date, you should harvest this much at this time. It never really worked, all right? It might have looked good on paper, but it doesn't often work that way in reality. So the Soviets often had to go abroad to purchase grain to feed their citizens so they wouldn't starve. Some of that grain comes from the West. Now, while Khrushchev and Brezhnev were talking about the great economic gains, the things the Western countries could always do was feed themselves. Not only did they have enough food, but they had plenty of new innovations and products that came about after World War II, things that consumers wanted to buy. Newer refrigerators, newer cars, the new invention of the television, and if you needed it, new houses, new ways of doing business, air conditioning. All these new inventions come about. The Western countries had them. The Soviet Union does not. And if the Soviet Union did have it, their products were often unreliable. They were sort of junky. They never worked out. They worked, but just barely so good. And then there wasn't enough of them. Soviets literally had to wait in almost a bread or a soup line just to get what they needed to survive, let alone any extras or wants, not needs. Most couldn't even think about owning their own vehicle. And all of this is due to the Central Planning Group, the central planners. The problem was that they were not in touch with the industrial worker or the manager on the factory floor. It's like World War I. I know you guys are probably tired of it, but it's like the general commanding the troops to move forward without understanding what the terrain was like, that there was in fact a hill there, that there were machine gun nests. It's great to sit in an office and on paper and decide what you're going to produce and how much of it, and if you do it according to my timetable, it'll work, but it doesn't meet practical reality. And when it comes to industrialization, the planners had no idea of how you would get the raw materials. Let's say coal and iron ore out of the ground. How long will it take to get to the smelting plant? They have no idea of mining or industrial production other than the figures that they write on paper. However, being part of the Central Planning Group was a great job. It guaranteed you a job for your entire life. It was centralized. It was run by the big-time Soviet communists. And so as a result, the Soviet workers are told to do things, to come to work, but they stand there. They don't have any raw materials. Here you have a group of people from, the late 80s who are waiting just to get basic necessities. And like, the examples I give you guys about raking leaves or the grades, why work extra? If I'm told to make 100, I'm only going to make 100 because I'm not going to get paid for making 101. And I'm going to do the minimum requirements. I'm not going to bust my tail or try and make it good in quality because it doesn't benefit me. This is how the Soviet economy will run for absolute decades. And so we get to the country of Hungary. Now, to compensate for the earlier Truman Doctrine, Premier Brezhnev institutes the Brezhnev Doctrine that says the Soviets can intervene in any Warsaw Pact country that not only has a problem with the Western democratic country, but actually talks about being democratic. This we just can't have. A lot of the citizens who were starving in Eastern Europe simply did not like this domination coming out of Moscow. So it's early on, right as Khrushchev is getting going, that the first quest for independence from the Soviet Union comes out of Hungary. When Hungarian Prime Minister Nagy tells the Soviets that they have to leave. You're no longer welcome in our country. And the Soviets are like, what? It's not like we're an invited guest. We're here because we want to be, and we are not going to leave. So as per usual, they send in the troops to put down the independence movement, and there's violence throughout Hungary. Nagy is captured, some of his supporters are captured and executed. And here are people lying in the street where Soviet tanks roll in Hungarian cities, just obliterating any and all dissent. Well, as soon as Hungary is put down, another rebellion kicks up in Poland. Poland had always been harshly treated by the Soviet Union. The Soviets enter Poland way back in the beginning of World War II in 1939. And the thing that really upset the Soviets was the Roman Catholic Church. It was dominant inside of Poland. Poland was one of the Eastern European countries that was not Russian Orthodox. They were Roman Catholic. And it is the church and church leaders that will slowly but quietly and steadily keep hammering and chipping away at communism in Poland. And the problem for the Soviets in Poland is that Poland had been experiencing just economic difficulties even before the communist takeover. When the communists come in and say we're going to make everything better, and it doesn't not only does it not get better, but it actually gets worse. The Polish workers began to protest by striking. They simply didn't work. And then you have Bishop and then Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, who several times when the Soviets went out to massacre the strike workers would stand in the intersection and tell them, like, you shall not pass, kind of, Gandalf-y. And in 1978, Karol Wojtyła was elected Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. He was the first non-Italian Pope in 500 years. Everybody voted for him but him. And he will become known as the Jedi Pope John Paul II. And he is the one that will begin to vocally support anti-communist dealings throughout Eastern Europe. And Pope John Paul will inspire one of the most famous workers in Polish history and the Solidarity movement, Lech Walesa. Lech will organize the Polish dock workers, longshoremen, into what he called the Solidarity movement. If we all stand together, they can't get rid of all of us. And the Soviets are like, that's it, we've had enough, here we go. They sent in the army to deal with the leadership of the movement, and 8 million, that is not a lie, 8 million people, including the leader, Lech Walesa, were arrested as a result. So there is Lech Walesa on top, and down on the bottom as we have, the legendary Pope John Paul II. And so this will kick in what is known as Detente. Lech Walesa will bring a visit by Pope John Paul, who has not been living in Poland, but had been living in Vatican. And Pope John Paul, when he arrives in Poland, he is a major religious and international political figure. What can the Soviets do to him? So he brings international attention to the ills of communism in Eastern Europe. And what détente is, there are several times throughout the Cold War, both sides were okay, look, enough is enough, we're getting pretty tense here, let's calm down and let's ease the tension. This is simply known as détente. And normally détente will focus around the reduction of nuclear missiles. By this time, the United States and the Soviet Union have enough firepower to destroy the world several times over. And it's looking like detente is going to work. And then, for whatever reason, we still don't know, maybe it was to get oil, I'm not sure, but the Soviets invade Afghanistan. When that happens, detente breaks down, and Afghanistan was yet one more strain on the Soviet economy that it simply couldn't handle. So detente stops. And finally, in 1985, a new leader is going to take over. The Khrushchev-Brezhnev era is over, and a younger guy named Mikhail Gorbachev, not an old line World War II Russian Revolution Soviet, takes over. And since he's younger, he sees things different than his, older colleagues. And he says, look it, man, we can't continue, we're going broke. He's kind of like King James of England saying, look, man, this garbage just ain't going to work. We've got to do something. We've got to fix it. The problem is the Soviets are still rolling, here they are rolling across the bridge into Afghanistan, where their famous helicopters are going to butcher the villages of the Mujahideen. But anyway, Gorbachev is going to end the war, hoping that it will quit straining the Soviet economy. He throws out the Brezhnev doctrine and says, look, we can't be everywhere. And he begins to negotiate with President Reagan nuclear arms reduction treaties, all right, whether you call them SALT talks, whatever. We're going to stand down from the nuclear weapons manufacturing, and he pulls the troops from Afghanistan. And he says, look, Eastern Europe, it's up for you to choose. We are not going to bother you. If you want to reform, go ahead, but if you want to stay with us, we'll stick with you. And so in 1989, a great day, the Solidarity Movement became a legal political party inside of Poland. And released from prison, Lech Walesa will be elected the first president of the newly democratic Poland. It hadn't been a state, right, since September of 1939, when the German Blitzkrieg conquered it. Poland is free. And along with that, Gorbachev is going to institute two new fun things to say, glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness. We are open. Come in and check us. We have nothing to hide. Ask us questions. And perestroika simply means overhaul. We are going to fix this economy. And much like Lenin's new economic plans, Gorbachev allowed some capitalist free market policies to exist. One of the things he said, factory managers, guys in the trenches, should have a greater say in what's going on in their factory. These central planning groups just aren't working. Let's talk to the guys who are doing the job. But if you give an opinion and we listen, you had daggone better be right. The problem is, there was way too much chaos. Everything was overhauling rapidly. And there was just simply too many things to do. And people thought it was like waving a magic wand, that everything would be happy and hunky-dory. But there was just way too much to do at one time. And so while Gorbachev's ideas and his intentions were solid, the people weren't ready to get on board. They really didn't know how this was going to work. And along with that, a lot of the Soviet border republics wanted to become independent, and they start to rebel. And so the people and some of the leaders by this time had had enough of Gorbachev. He will be replaced by Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin is going to come in, and it is Yeltsin, not Gorbachev, who sees and is credited for the breakup of the old Soviet hierarchy. Now Russia is technically a democratic republic. I just think that it was just a switch, and the same governmental guys just switched titles. But anyway, that's my opinion. When the problems weren't immediately solved, people said, man, this isn't any better than communism. At least we had a job. Let's go back to that. And here is Boris Yeltsin. But all these areas, Poland, the new Czech Republic, the new Slovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia will break up, Romania, the Ukraine, the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia will all recede from the Soviet Union, except for Belarusia right there on the other side. There's Belarus, and there's a little bit of Russia on the other side of Belarus and Lithuania. It's very odd. But anyway, along with that, there are other problems. Inside the Soviet Union, there are a lot of religious and ethnic minority dissent. They wanted to become their own countries. They weren't Russian, they weren't Slavic, they weren't Russian Orthodox. They want to be different, especially the territory of Chechnya. Now, many former Warsaw Pact countries like the Czech Republic and Poland wanted to join NATO. They wanted to switch defensive alliances. And this was just a little bit too much. Russia, their rubber band was stretching. They could only handle so much. But while democracy is slowly beginning to kindle, it's slowly beginning to grow, Russia, once one of the two dominant superpowers in the world, sees its influence dwindle. Nobody was afraid of the Soviet Union anymore. And then on the great night of November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall, separating East Berlin and East Germany and West Berlin, is torn down. All right, I got to bring this piece to show you guys one of these days. The visible symbol of the block, the wall, which no one was allowed to cross, comes down. It was a euphoric moment for everybody in Germany. They were extremely happy. And so these are all the former Soviet satellite states: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, the Ukraine, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan are now independent countries. As I'm sure you're aware, I sometimes slip and still call it Czechoslovakia. The Czech Republic is now two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The former territory that was split between the Ottomans and the Austria-Habsburgs for a while actually becomes 7 different countries, different regional ethnicities, different regional religions, and each group is trying to cleanse/genocide the other. And the one area that Boris Yeltsin would not let go of is Chechnya. He says, no, you are staying there. As a result, there's still bloody guerrilla fighting going on in Chechnya to this day. It's in the borderland with some Islamic groups and other like Russian groups. So it is just rough and tumble. It's the Wild West. As Yeltsin gets older, in 1999, a younger old hardliner, Vladimir Putin, was asked to take over the reins of Russia. He was an old KGB, FSB agent that creates a new fancy democratic title. And he is the prime minister for several years, and then he rewrites the Constitution, allowing him to be permanently elected president in 2012. Last guy who did that didn't work out so well for him. His name was Adolf Hitler, and for the world. So immediately he tries to reclaim territory in the Ukraine that is rich in natural gas. He refuses to have the Soviet fleet leave Sevastopol, where they were supposed to leave in 1999. And a lot of people see him as an old, like Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev throwback. Along with the breakup of the Soviet Union, these problems have flared up. We are all familiar with terrorism, from Al-Qaeda to the Taliban to ISIS. The World Trade Center bombing in 1992 and the attacks in 2001, the bombings in Boston during the marathon, and other attempts, in London, in Canada, in Paris, and in Nice. There is massive ecological problems, deforestation, over-farming, cash crops, pollution, and food and water shortages. All of this is hurt by the ongoing problems that we have. But that's it, guys. I'll see you for our last day here shortly.